My brothers and I stood there for a mere moment, watching. The flow of blood poured from the elven corpse's neck onto the carpet. Two red rivers pressing against the fleshy ground to finally meet at the edge, forming waterfalls to continue its descent. It filled my mind with pure ecstasy. The death of our enemy, finally seeing them wounded and helpless to us. It was a rush to my head, a joy to my heart. I have slain elves before, but the ones we slew prior were from mere settlements and holds, ones that settled away from the empires their kind erected. This elf's death was in mankind's former capital, the birthplace of the human empire. This was justice. Yet justice came too swiftly, for this elf's death may mean our activities within Sunraiser will soon be discovered. My brother Tarbram acted quickly to remedy this problem as he ran to the body and kept it from dripping any more blood onto the white carpet. "Bulin, curse it! We have to clean this mess quickly," Tarbram yelled in a hushed manner, letting the blood flow onto a cloth that he held in his hand. "Cut the carpet, torn. Bulin, help me carry it to the storage room. Quickly now." My brother Bulin stared at the body in an almost intoxicated stupor, the pleasure of the kill overwhelming him as it ingrained itself in his mind. I hadn't seen him express such gladness since he married his beloved. Gladness I could understand. Though, this ecstasy was quickly swept aside as he refocused himself and helped our brother carry the body away from the room. I drew my knife and cut a hole in the carpet where the blood had spilled onto, then cut a few smaller holes to make it look as if rats had chewed through it. I stuffed the pieces of carpet into my coat pocket and put my knife away. I stood up and turned towards Folty, who was placing his hand over his mouth. Vomit was dripping through the spaces in between his fingers. I stepped lively towards him. I pulled open one of his coat pockets and brought it up to his mouth so that he could relieve himself of the bile. Folty finished his heaving and wiped his mouth. I noticed his eyes were watering and snot was dribbling out of his nose. I helped prop him against the wall as he let out a mixture of heaves and sobs. "I can't help it." Folty managed to get out before he continued his heaving and sobbing. I watched his reactions closely. He gripped his neck with one hand while simultaneously wiping tears from his eyes with the other. It seemed as if he was in pain, but I could do nothing for him but simply observe and stop him from screaming if he was forced to. After a minute of weakness, Folty recomposed himself, taking deep breaths in. I grasped his shoulders. "What is wrong?" I asked, as I assumed he may have been able to speak then. He took several deep breaths before beginning with, I do not know. Was it the death of the elf? Can you not stomach what we have come here to do?" "No, maybe. Something simply felt wrong, and I couldn't control it. I swear to you." I turned to the ground, where snot and bile spilled. I let go of my brother and turned to clean it up as best as I could, using my coat as a rag for the mess. "Folty, keep searching the shelves for anything you can find." I heard a groan of agreement as Folty stepped past me and back towards the bookshelf, where he started flipping through volumes once again, after he wiped his hands clean with his coat, of course. I cleaned the stains that were made by Folty, which had landed on the wood floorboards and not the carpet. We would have to find a way to wash, if not dispose of our cloaks after this. But I didn't linger on the thought for very long, as I needed to watch the door for any more guards that could potentially barge in. I walked over to the door and bent down to look through the keyhole. I peered through to only see an empty hallway, as well as the two empty corridors it connected itself to. It stayed that way for a time, until the return of Tarbram and Bulin, who crept towards the door. The zealousness had faded from Bulin's face, and had turned into a look of disappointment. Tarbram seemed rather neutral, despite what had happened. I let them in, and shut the door behind them. Tarbram approached Folty and put a hand on his shoulder. Bulin sat against a wall and simply stared down at the ground. I turned back towards the keyhole and kept watch. "This book gives a brief history on the priesthood of the elves, if that is of any interest to us," Folty asked. "No," Tarbram stated bluntly. "We need something about the Argyle." Fine, maybe this," Folty stated as he pulled out another book from the shelf. "And that is?" Tarbram asked. "The Practical Applications of Magic for Practical Magicians, a lesson by Fel Ultun." "That has nothing to do with the Argyle." "Yes, but there is nothing else here about the Argyle. One can assume that there is no dossier for elven champions within a temple such as this. He has a point, Tarbum, I added. Best we take the history and the magic book, as they seem to be the best we could hope to find in a place such as this. We could have pilfered a library for these, Tarbum states agitatedly. Folty looks at the two books closely, at the covers and the bindings. I wouldn't be so hasty. If they are in the priest's office, they must hold some information that isn't easily accessible. The magic book, maybe, but are there any more books that may be of use? Folty gives the bookshelf one last look through, running his finger against the book bindings. No, he confirms. Nothing else. Most are the elves' fatherly texts. Heretical, I commented. Take what we have then, and let us be off, Tarbum says, handing the Southern Ranger's book to Folty. Folty clears his throat and shows him the coat pocket that was filled with vomit. Tarbum veered his head back in frustration and shoved the books into his own pocket before walking to the door. Folty gave an anxious smile as he adjusted his coat and followed. I opened the door for them, and they stepped out. I turned towards Bulin, who still sat against the wall, staring down at the ground. Make haste, I demanded of Bulin. He looked at me, nodded, and stood up to leave for the door. As he shuffled out, I gave the room one last look, seeing if we had left any other trace of our presence in here, though I had found none. I shut the door gently behind me, and followed my brothers who were softly making their way towards the storage room. We walked up the flight of stairs, and briefly walked down the hall, Folty awkwardly attempting to not slosh around the mess inside of his coat pocket, Tarbum fiddling for the keychain he had used to unlock and relock the door, and Bulin keeping his head aimed at the floor. As we reached the door, Tarbum pulled the key up to the lock and unlocked it, then held it open for us before closing it again to relock it. Folty walked towards the exit we had made through the glass tile window, but was stopped by Tarbum, who had pulled a knife from Bulin's coat pocket. What are you doing? Folty asked nervously, as Tarbum bent down in front of him, knife in hand. Tarbum cut the coat pocket that was filled with refuse, and folded part of it to prevent it from spilling out at the top. Oh, thank you, Folty stated, as Tarbum carried the pocket to an old satchel that was laid on the floor, placing it inside. He then took the satchel to a closet, which I realized was where the guard's body was stored. He placed the satchel behind the elf's body and shut the closet door. I prayed to the Father that the body wouldn't be found before we had accomplished our errand here in Sunraiser. As I prayed, my brother Tarbum walked towards the opening we had made in the roof and climbed through it. He reached his hand down to pull Folty through, then Bulin, then I, lastly. We were once again up on the roof. Tarbum slowly slid the glass tile back onto the wood frame it was glued to and attempted to cake the flakes of resin back onto the sides of the tile. We all waited a moment for him to finish before he stood up on the roof and turned to the tower we had leapt from. He drew 2 knives from his pocket and ran for the tower. He flew once again, from building to tower. He crashed into it, but managed to pierce through the wood with his knives. He let out a soft grunt as he settled himself down and began his descent down the wall of the tower with his knives. Tarbum looked to his left and his right, carefully watching for guards, I assumed. As my brother touched down onto the ground, he crept towards the church softly and extended his arms up towards us. Folty looked down for a moment and laughed to himself as he collapsed onto the roof of the building. Confound it, Folty states after his laughing fit. That is a 40-foot drop, Neely. Father, confound it. Remember our 5th courtesy, Folty, I stated as I looked down at Tarbum. Bulin, you first, for Folty's sake. Bulin walked up to the edge of the roof and stared down at his brother. He took a deep breath in, then sighed, then another deep breath before plummeting towards our brother. I looked over the edge to see Tarbum grasping our brother in his arms, squeezing him tight as he placed him onto the ground. Bulin shakes himself off before extending his arms upward, mimicking Tarbum, who was doing the same once again. Folty groaned as he stepped up to the edge of the building. Remember the 5th, remember the 5th, remember the 5th, he murmured to himself multiple times before taking a moment to breathe in and out. Same as Bulin, though in a much more dramatic fashion. He turned back towards me and smiled. I nodded my head softly. He turned back towards his brothers, took one final deep breath, and fell towards the 2 of them, I took my turn. Lastly, I peered down at the three of them, Folty being set down to regain his balance, while the other two extended their arms towards me. My brothers and I, not including Folty, had jumped from cliffs into great pools of water to overcome our fear of heights, and the shake one would get after falling from such a high place. This shake was similar to the one Folty was experiencing. I took one step towards nothing and began my plummet towards my brothers. The wind rushed past my feet, through my clothes, and into my face as I fell towards them. In a few mere seconds, I had made it into the arms of my kin and was set onto the ground. Tarbum wasted no time ushering us towards the rows of towers to hide our presence. We grouped together by the crates that were stacked against the tower and took a moment to sit down and rest. I looked towards my brothers, all weary but in different ways. Folty was exhausted. Something had taken its toll on Bulin, and Tarbum seemed displaced as he looked at the covers of the books we had found. I cleared my throat before taking a seat on a crate. Though Father watches us, we have shown our cunning and skill this night, brothers. Do you not agree, Tarbum? Tarbum looked at me, putting the book back into his coat pocket. He turned towards Folty and Bulin, who fixed their gaze upon their eldest. Aside from the guard, you two did fine. Folty and Bulin turned back towards the ground, soft grins laden upon their faces. But keep improving, Tarbum added, as he turned his face towards the streetway. We sat there for half a minute, in silence, catching our breaths and contemplating our actions. The silence was broken by Bulin asking, "Should we return to our guide?" "Yes, and make haste. We'll conjoin once you have departed from him. I imagine he'll want to report what happened to himself, and you three, if you decide to lay unconscious as well." "That would be the best course of action. He won't suspect a thing that way." "Then depart, Father with you," Tarbum stated as he himself departed from us. I stood up from my seat on the crate and rallied my brothers to the end of the alleyway. I looked to my left, then my right, to only see a lack of guards. A few were talking to each other at the far end of the street. We took our chance to cross into the next row of towers, passing through them, then into the alley where the sewer house was, our guide asleep behind the relief station. We took off our coats and masks, shoving them into our bags. Folty made several soft groans to himself, out of disgust for his coat's current state, I assumed. We quickly latched our bags closed and gathered around our unconscious guide. He was sound asleep. "Folty, lay down next to him. Bulin, lay down in front of the two of them. I'll rouse our guide from his slumber." They nodded their heads and did as they were directed. I took my spot, kneeling next to our guide. I clasped my hands together and muttered a prayer of safety for my brethren and I. Afterwards, I clasped my hands around the shoulders of my guide and shook him till he awoke. Huh? What happened?" Azadon asked upon awakening, grasping my arms to stop my shaking. "A vandal, a cad. We were attacked!" I exclaimed in response to his query, ceasing my shaking. "By our father! The saint's lair has an attacker!" he yelled in response. "I must inform the guard!" Our guide arose, removing my hands from his shoulders, and ran out of the alleyway as fast as he could. I turned towards my siblings, who also arose. "Well, that was trivial," Folty commented. "But will Tarbum make it out? I imagine they will secure the lair in mere moments. Knowing him, he's left the lair already. We are fine. We should worry about them discovering they are missing a guard." Bulin's face becomes one of discomfort, while Folty loses himself to his thoughts. I turn back towards the end of the alleyway, where several guards accompany Azadon, the lot of them walking our way. The guard that led the group assisted Folty, pulling him to his feet, while another approached me. "Azadon informed us of your attacker. Can you describe them in any way? Height, smell, maybe a voice?" the elf had inquired of me. "They wore a dark cloak, and spoke in a harsh way. That is all I was able to make out from our attacker," I responded. "Yes, he was quite a fright," Folty added. "A he? That narrows it down then," the guard said in reply, turning to face Folty. "It may have been a woman, though," Bulin stated, as a way to amend Folty's mistake. "Too slim to be a man." The guard rubbed its chin, looking at the two of my brothers before turning back towards me. "We shall bring this to your ambassador. An alley is no place to be discussing an intrusion of this nature. Follow along. We all followed behind the elven god, Azadon staying close to its side, while my brothers and I kept some distance, though the guards behind us made sure it was a respectable distance. Fulti approached my side and slightly turned his head towards me. "I apologize, brother," he shared with me in a hushed manner. "Now is not the time, Fulti," I responded in a quick, yet frustrated manner, veering ever so slightly away from him. "But I must ask," he exclaimed, veering himself ever so slightly towards me. "Will Saul be suspicious?" "What are you men muttering?" one of the guards behind us asked, in a harsh way. "My brother is simply nervous, nothing more," I responded. The guard muttered something to itself before shutting up. I turned towards Fulti. "Pray to the Father, that is all you must do," I stated solemnly. My brother nodded, though an expression of worry overcame him, despite the order I had given. He veered himself away from me, putting space between us. I knew my advice of faith had fallen on deaf ears, but as long as I was there to guide him, we would overcome any challenge. Come the traitor Saul, come the Agile, our Father protects us, even when we doubt.